was with Icahn 7 years ago. So hopefully I've improved a little bit since that day, not quite as nervous, but it's always nice to be back and among several friends who do this work in your institution. So it's such a pleasure, and such a pleasure to be able to connect and present with Christine Lowe, who will be able to talk about the implications of our results and how things work within your institution, which I think is really an important point. So as noted, we're going to be talking about this paper. Introductions have already occurred, and we do not have any conflicts of interest, although I think it's important to note that we've both been members of a board that does advocate for equal access in health science education. And we both continue to be involved in the Docs with Disabilities initiative on another group that does advocacy work for equal access for disability in medical education. And that group is called AIM. All right, today we have a couple of learning objectives for the group, and that includes reciting the assessment and graduation outcomes for medical students with disabilities across different categories of disability, and to also describe the mechanisms for removing barriers to medical education for learners with disabilities and how to apply these according to your own institution. And Christine will be covering that part. Before we started our time together today, I really wanted to give you the gestalt, because you may be surprised by some of our findings. You may also not be aware of the number of things that are happening in this space. So first, I'll talk about the prevalence of disability, and this is only looking at the work coming out of my research lab. There is work that happened prior to this, I think starting in about 2009, but that was really looking at specific categories of disability. So physical disabilities, deaf and hard of hearing, learning disabilities. My work looks, and our team's work looks at disability across the board. So we're talking about psychological disability, learning disability, mobility, chronic health, deaf and hard of hearing, low vision, all categories of disability. And what we found when we did our kind of benchmark study is in 2016 that we had about 2.9% nationally of prevalence with disability. Now, this is pulling data that's verified data from the medical schools themselves. In fact, this is one of the ways that I met Christine Lowe. So pulling verified data from the medical school, people like Christine Lowe have looked at and established disability coverage for this individual. This is only an MD school. So we do have DO school data, but today I'm just going to focus on the MD data. So in 2016, we were at 2.9%. Moving into 2019, we saw a pretty dramatic increase, about a 69% relative increase in disability representation. And that took us up to about 4.5%. I have the data from our 2021 wave, which also looked at what this kind of gave us a snapshot of what disability disclosure and requests for accommodation looked like under COVID-related conditions. So a lot of remote implementation of accommodations, remote testing, things of that nature.
Back together, you know.
I'm sorry. Oh, and while the numbers did increase again, we're at 5.98%, so almost 6%. They didn't increase at the same rate that they had between 2016 and 2019. Now, this will come out at some point in a paper, but I'll let you know that this was primarily the fact that this didn't increase as much was primarily due to a significant decrease in the disclosure of learning disabilities and requests for testing related accommodations. This was not surprising to us, given that we had to move to more of a universal design when we delivered curriculum remotely. And so if you think about a learner with a learning disability or ADHD who needs to set an environment that works specifically for them, perhaps reduce distraction, something of that nature, they may not need that type of accommodation when they're taking the test remotely and they can identify a setting that works best for them. So more to come. Look for a publication on that very soon. But we were not surprised by these findings. It's also important to note that, while the average is around 6%, there's a huge range out there. So we have some schools year after year telling us that they don't have any students with disabilities. That is definitely likely not true. They're just not creating an environment where a student feels comfortable disclosing. There are also schools that have, and this is from the 2019, I don't have the 2021 range quite yet. I think it's closer to 26%. But in 2019, the range topped at 20%. All right, now 2 things might be driving this. If you're not familiar with these publications, I'll give you just a little bit of background. In 2018, we saw a report come out from the AAMC that looked at kind of the experiences of learners with disabilities across the UME to GME continuum and into practice. So we actually got to look at the student, the trainee, and the physician and what their experiences had been like, either currently or respectively. And then we also have a report that came out from the AMA in 2021. Now, the guidance that the AMA gave in 2018 was contextualized as considerations. So what the AAMC was saying was, we want you to read this report, understand the experiences that these trainees are having, and we want you to consider doing some actions that are more supportive of individuals with disabilities. When the AMA report came out, the language had shifted quite a bit and it became a recommendation. And in the AMA report, it really was just stronger language around some of the same thematic things that we saw in that AAMC report. Among them being that you should have a disability specialist, somebody like Christine Lowe, in the medical school proper, to be able to fully and accurately adjudicate these disability-related and accommodation-related decisions. And so you've been really practicing best practice for quite a few years. You're ahead of the game there. So given that context, I'll take you back to looking at, how students are doing in their educational experience. And so we were looking at the performance and trajectory of medical students with disabilities. We did look at students who had graduated. So we only considered students who had graduated. And as mentioned, this is published in Academic Medicine. It is an open access article, so you should have easy access to it. And we did have quite a big team on this paper because we included representatives from all of the schools. So all of our partners from all of the schools that participated were also authors on this paper. And we had 5 primary research questions. Question 1, do students with cognitive or physical disabilities perform equally well on standardized exams? So looking at step 1 and step 2 CK. Do students with cognitive and physical disabilities take longer to graduate? Do students with cognitive and physical disabilities have increased odds of taking a leave of absence? And do students with cognitive and physical disabilities match into residency with equal success on their first attempt? Now, I am going to give you some disclaimers as we go along. That first attempt was after scramble or SOAP. So this could be actually a pseudo second attempt, but not a formal second attempt. And then, are students with cognitive and physical disabilities more likely to enter primary care? So those were our research questions. And looking at our method, we used graduated students from cohorts 2018 and 2019. That gave us a total of 171 students with disabilities across the 11 schools and 341 controls. And we did a control of 2-to-1, matching within institution and within graduation year. I believe there was one exception because we couldn't find a match for all of our variables. And we matched on MCAT score, and that was plus or minus 2 points. And we worked with the AAMC to establish the best way to match on MCAT. We did match on gender because we know that there are known gender differences in performance on some of these exams. And then we controlled for dual degree when looking at time to graduation. So that TTG is time to graduation. So obviously, if you're an MD, MPH student, it's going to take you longer to graduate. And so we allowed for that time and controlled for that time. Originally, we'd invited 12 medical schools, 3 medical schools in each of 4 AAMC regions. We really looked to have representation from both private, public, rural, and urban schools. We did have 1 school drop out, as I mentioned before. This study was published in 2021. So as you might imagine, we were collecting data in 2020, just as the pandemic hit. We actually consider ourselves quite lucky to have been able to still collect the data, and we're relatively unscathed by the pandemic and completing this. But we did have 1 school in the West drop out. And 69% of the students that we reviewed were students with cognitive and learning disabilities. So just really quickly, we dichotomized disability category, which has all kinds of implications, not the least of which is that disability doesn't present equally among individuals, even within the same category of disability. So trying to say something about disability broadly is kind of a tenuous thing to begin with. But in order to have some meaning from our data that could tell us about differences, and based on some of our hypotheses, we did dichotomize this. So when we talk about physical disabilities, we're talking about anything sensory, hearing, deaf and hard of hearing, physical disabilities. And then when we talk about cognitive-based disabilities, we are talking about learning disabilities, psychological disabilities, and ADHD. As you might imagine, and what we've done moving forward is we've actually pulled out chronic health. Because as you might imagine, for chronic health, there could be physical implications. There could also be cognitive implications, dealing with chronic pain, things of that nature. So in our study, since this study, we have really looked to try to be as authentic as possible in representing what it's like to be part of a different category of disability and how that might affect performance. So our outcomes were the USMLE Step 1 and Step 2 CK performances, time to graduation, leave of absence, match to residency on first attempt, and as I said before, this does include scramble or SOAP, and then the match specialty. And what we found, again, within the dichotomized categories, so for mobility, chronic health, and sensory, we found that a higher percentage of students with disabilities took a leave of absence. However, despite that higher leave of absence, we found that all of these students graduated on time. So within that time to graduation, there were no differences. There were also no differences on the Step 1 scores, no differences on match on first attempt, and there were higher rates of matching into primary care for this group of learners. Now, this finding kind of in aggregate with other findings across other studies really suggests that for students with mobility and sensory disabilities and chronic health disabilities, for the most part, these students don't differ at all. They've been quite successful. The biggest barrier, I think, for this specific group is just entry to medical school, to be honest, and the assumptions and kind of ableist ideas that we bring to the table as medical educators or admissions folks. So this group fared quite well. The findings for cognitive, learning disability, ADHD, and psychological disabilities were not as positive. There were higher rates of students that took a leave of absence. These students, though, were less likely to graduate on time, even taking into consideration dual degree. One of the reasons that we believe these students, or hypothesize that these students took longer to graduate, is that they hit a kind of a barrier wall when it came to the USMLE Step 1 examination, and that they were unable to get accommodations for that exam. When weighing the pros and cons of going forward and taking the exam or appealing that accommodation request decision, many students decided to take a leave of absence for a year and appeal their decisions. So while we don't have specific data on this, we are collecting it right now. We're about to start Pathways 2. and we'll be collecting that level of data. Our hypothesis is that the major barrier for students in this category is the step one accommodation process. And Christine's going to talk to you about that a little bit more. They also had significantly lower step one scores, 12.2 points lower on average. However, in keeping with our hypothesis that accommodations on the step one examination is the major barrier for these students, what we did note was that for a subset of students where we did have accommodation data, so we knew that they had been accommodated on the step one exam, those students only scored 6 points lower. So that's, it's a 50% difference when you're looking at whether students were accommodated or not. These students were also less likely to match on first attempt. And so it's understandable when you have a lower step score and you've taken longer to graduate, how that makes sense that it would be more difficult to match on first attempt. We also had some findings that were unique by gender. Male students with cognitive or learning disabilities on average had mean scores that were nearly 18 points lower than their non-disabled male controls. So this is only male to male students. Male students with cognitive and learning disabilities had on average mean scores that were 13 points lower when they were only compared to other students with disabilities that were physical and sensory in nature. So this is comparing disabled to disabled, but across the two dichotomized categories, and male to male. And then no significant differences between controls for students that also had physical and sensory disabilities. Findings by gender for female students with cognitive and learning disabilities had significant lower scores than controls, but only about 9 points. So that's a lot less than those male students that we had. No differences from female students with physical sensory disabilities, as I noted before, no differences in performance. And then when compared to females with physical and sensory disabilities, so again, comparing disability category to disability category, they were only slightly lower than, but still significant from the controls. Okay, one of the other things that came out of this data set and that we published separately in JAMA Open was looking at, because again, we had controlled based on MCAT scores. So as you know, MCAT is highly predictive of step one scores. And we wanted to know for this particular population of students with disabilities, whether that prediction held. And in fact, it did. So the MCAT scores of students with disabilities were highly predictive of their step one and step two scores. And why is that important? Well, I think that when we look at data and we say, okay, these students aren't performing as well, there could be concerns that, coupled with the kind of ableist belief systems that we all hold, I hold them, I catch myself constantly in an ableist kind of cognitive loop, that we're able to disrupt that actively and say, okay, yes, the student has a disability, and yes, we know the outcome of this, especially for cognitive and learning and psychological disabilities. We know that the outcomes are poorer than their non-disabled peers. However, we can go in and with some certainty say that if this student had a strong MCAT score, we're not going to worry as much about them scoring, not passing step one, for example. And I think that's the concern I hear from a lot of admissions committees, is that they want to admit students of diverse backgrounds, but their concern is that they'll be bringing students in who won't be able to pass step one. And so they'll be kind of stuck in this gray zone. But we do know that the MCAT score is highly predictive. We also aim to show that the accommodations on step one are kind of the largest barrier, and that if those accommodations were in place, that students would not have these differences in performance. So our conclusion was that barriers remain for medical students with cognitive and learning disabilities, but these are partially mitigated by accommodations on board exams, and that future research should review the learning climates that may play a role in student success for students with disabilities. Because one thing that you'll note that I didn't talk about is these students were coming from 11 different schools. One of the agreements that we had with the schools in order to get this data was that we wouldn't make comparisons between the schools, because we didn't want to, or we wouldn't do it because we wouldn't publish it, right? It was a decision and an agreement that we had going into the work, because we didn't want to say this school is doing a poor job or make the assumption that this school was doing a poor job. We wanted to look at overall performance. But we do think that there's a role in looking at the learning climate. So one of the things we do plan to do in Pathways 2, which will be launched in November, is to look at the schools and whether or not, for example, they've hired a disability resource professional. What is the education background of that person? What kind of professional development does that person have? And then, despite differences in step 1 performance and extended time to graduation, it's important to note that all of these students graduated and all of these students matched, whether it was on attempt 1 or attempt 2. And remember that for students with physical, sensory, and chronic health disabilities, they all matched on first attempt. And many of them matched into primary care, an area where we really need physicians, but also where physicians with disabilities can uniquely impact medicine, and that they'll have a longitudinal relationship with their patients. So knowing that 1 in 4 patients is a patient with a disability, having that kind of informed care can be really important. And then again, MCAT remains a strong predictor of step 1. We do plan to do follow-up research. We had a paper come out in +1 a few months ago that looked at the differences in the pathway for students that applied for accommodations and got them, and students who applied for accommodations and were rejected. And just in a nutshell, the outlook was really detrimental for students who went ahead and took the step 1 accommodation or step 1 exam unaccommodated. And so it's really important that for Pathways 2, we get really good data on whether or not these students were accommodated. And we started this 2 years ago. We did ask everyone to start keeping data on whether students got accommodated on step 1. So we're really excited to be able to look at that and to have more power in our study, because we didn't have enough, which we think really kept us from seeing significance there. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to your own Christine Lowe.
Hi, everybody. Thanks again for having us today. Before I jump in, I just want to give a quick thank you to 2 people. Dr. Cunningham, who participated in the initial meeting around the Pathways study, and also to our registrar, Nelson Pei, who was a fantastic partner in gathering all of the data that was required for this study. So quick shout out. So my role is really to stay at the forefront of best practices in disability inclusion and to help Icahn develop a robust program that supports students with diverse lived experiences. So these are some of the ways that the DS office can further that aim. Advocating for the use of universal design principles in our curriculum, the use of a broad scope of innovative accommodations, adoption of functional technical standards, keeping disability at the forefront in the discussions around diversity and inclusion, all with the end goal of creating a diverse health science workforce. Thank you. So I wanted just to share some statistics. For some context, when I came on board in late 2016, there were very few students registered in the Disability Services Office and not a lot of data. And my predecessor at that time was only working 1 day a week. I came on board at 2 days a week and began to make some changes to ensure students were aware there was a disability service office. And I also started keeping some more detailed data. And as the numbers of students registering in disability services grew, I moved from 2 days a week to full time. So this slide shows the growth of students working with our Disability Services Office over the last 7 years. In academic year 2015-16, we had 49 students register. And as you can see, those numbers have grown steadily each year. In 2018-19, the year of the Pathways study, we were working with 128 students. And you can see that the DS office served 187 students last year. So these are the Disability Services Office statistics relevant to the Pathways study. Luckily, we were a little bit ahead of the game, and I was already collecting a lot of the data that was needed for the Pathways study. And I wanted to show you how that year, the 2018-19 academic year, compared with last academic year. So you can see in this slide, these are the numbers of medical students in the various disability categories that Dr. Meeks described. And I've put here the categories as defined by the Pathways study. And then in parentheses, I've also included the categories that are used by the New York State Education Department. So for psychological disabilities, we had 23 students in 2018-19 and 41 in 2021-22. In the physical disabilities category, we had 31 students in both years. Cognitive disabilities, we had 28 students in 2018-19 and 38 students in 2021-22. And in the sensory category, we had 1 student in 2018-19 and 5 in 21-22. So I wanted to highlight some of the study findings that you heard from Dr. Meeks, but that really struck me when we got the results from the Pathways study. And the first thing I think it's really important to hold on to is that students with disabilities do well in medical school. The study found that 2 graduating cohorts of students with disabilities across 11 institutions generally graduated on time and matched to residency. The second thing that struck me was that step accommodations really matter. Dr. Meeks has already highlighted this a little. When students with disabilities were accommodated on step 1, scores increased 5.9 points on average. And that suggests that accommodations have made a measurable impact on their step 1 scores. Moreover, this increase eliminates half of the score differences between students with disabilities and controls, suggesting the lack of accommodation on step 1 is a key driver of score differences. Importantly, in Pathways 1, only about 25% of students in the study sample used accommodations on step 1. Thus, it may be that lack of accommodations or access to accommodations on step 1 that contributes to the differences in performance seen in that cognitive learning disabilities group that Dr. Meeks was talking about. And that group, again, represented 69% of the sample of students with disabilities in the Pathways study. When I was reviewing the study findings, what I was really looking for was ways that, or opportunities where the Disability Service Office could make an impact for students. So another finding that really struck out to me was that students with cognitive learning disabilities were less likely to match to residency on first attempt than the non-disabled controls. And that step 1 score was the only significant association, with each 1 point increase in step 1 score, increasing the odds of matching on first attempt by 4%. So what does this mean for my office? In DS, we want to reach students early and work with students individually to ensure they have a uniquely suited accommodation plan in place and encourage students to utilize their accommodations, not to wait until they're behind or in academic difficulty. So in order to reach them, the Disability Service Office has layered messaging across multiple platforms. Matriculated students get an email announcing the DS office and providing contact information. Disability services information is updated annually in the student handbooks. We participate at all the orientations, which the medical school is now calling Base Camp. Last year, I partnered with a group of students to overhaul the Disability Services webpage on the school's website. There's now more information available, and the students made it more user-friendly, and we added more resources. Classes in both schools have a syllabus statement referring students to the Disability Service Office. And as we know, students talk to each other. So as the number of students that we're serving continue to grow, the word of mouth spreads and more students learn about what we can offer. I have a great example of that. A few years ago, I had a second-year student who contacted me saying that she was preparing to drop out of medical school. She described that she was really overwhelmed and stressed, and she just didn't think she was going to make it. And so she was calling home on a regular basis, kind of prepping her family so that when she did drop out, they were not taken by surprise. One of her roommates, who was registered in the Disability Service Office, heard some of these calls and persistently was telling the student, you know, call Christine, at least try, go and see her. She might be able to help you, you know, at least give it a shot before you actually drop out of school. And she did reach out to us, and we put an accommodation plan in place. And I'm thrilled to say that she graduated. So if Lisa, can you change to the next slide? Thank you. So the research findings around improved STEP scores for students with disabilities who used accommodations and the association between STEP scores and matching into residency confirmed the importance of my office working closely with students on their USMLE accommodation applications. As many of you are aware, the application process is arduous and very time-consuming for students. It's also time-consuming for my office. The work with each student takes anywhere between 10 and 20 hours per student, but it's well worth it because we have really good success with many of our students being approved for their accommodations. In this slide, you can see that in academic year 2018-19, the year of the Pathways study, 15 students worked with the Disability Service Office and initiated accommodation applications with the USMLE. And out of those, 13 of the applications were approved for accommodations. One student's application was denied, and the student decided not to appeal the decision. And one student's application was pending when I reached out to get the outcome, and the student didn't respond to outreach, so I couldn't confirm the outcome. That's the other that you see in that category. I compared that with last year. So last academic year in 2021-22, 20 students initiated applications with support from the Disability Service Office for USMLE STEP accommodations. But remember, there's been a significant change at Icahn. Since the Pathways study, taking and passing STEP exams is no longer a progression requirement at Icahn. It's now a graduation requirement. So students have a lot more discretion in terms of when they take those exams. So out of those 20 initial initiated applications, 8 of the students decided not to pursue the application because they weren't going to test last year. And so they postponed their test, and I'm actually working with them now. Out of the remaining 12, 9 applications were approved for accommodations by the USMLE, and that leaves 3. One of our students was dismissed from the program. One student's application was pending when I reached out, and I could not confirm the outcome. And then this is another great example of the close work that we do with students in the Disability Service Office. I have a student who was graduating, and he reached out to me asking if I could walk him through the process for applying for applications for Step 3. And he said, I know I'm not going to take Step 3 until after my intern year, but I'm concerned that I might not have the same level of support in my residency program as I do from your office. And so I'm wondering if you would walk me through the process of applying for this now so that I'll know what to do when the time comes. And I was happy to do that. So I'm anxiously awaiting the outcome to see how he did on that exam. So I'm excited about Pathways 2, which Lisa announced we're going to be starting in November. And I'll let Lisa walk you through what's going to happen in Pathways 2.
Great. So some of you, I've seen some incredible questions. I'm excited to get to those in just a moment. But we know that there are other things we need to be looking at. And so in Pathways 2, we're going to look at the performance and trajectory through the lens of multiple marginalizations. So we're going to collect data on ethnicity and race. We're also going to collect data on first generation students, and we may be collecting more data. We're looking at what the application process will allow for these cohorts. Obviously, on some of the cohorts that we'll be collecting, we'll also have some data on what happened during COVID. And then we will be collecting more robust data on USMLE approvals. One of the things I don't mention here, we've expanded Pathways 2 to 18 schools. We've done that in the hopes of getting greater power to be able to look at some of these. And in response to one of the questions in the chat, one of the things that we're also hoping to be able to do is to look by discrete category of disability. Now that still has a lot of barriers and assumptions, and none of the disability work is clean. It's all very messy because of the presentation of disability. in different categories. And so what one person experiences and the interaction between their experience and the environment, which could exacerbate specific symptoms. But we are hoping to get as finite as we can with this new study. And then collecting data on the time of diagnosis. This was something that was brought up, and I want to give all kudos to the reviewers. I've had an amazing experience with academic medicine with reviewers. They seem very invested in improving this work. And one of the reviewers said, I would be really interested to know what the outcomes are for students who come into medical school knowing that they have a disability and having had accommodations in the past versus students who come into medical school, struggle, and are diagnosed. And the reviewer noted that their assumption was that those individuals may have very different paths and very different levels of success based on their experience navigating this environment. And then we have a larger cohort. So I did bring that up. And our team works directly with the AAMC. We wrote the questions for the Y2Q and the GQ, or disability related, and we're also analyzing those findings. I can tell you preemptively, we're finalizing a paper right now that will come out. One of our findings suggests that students with disabilities have far higher levels of empathy when they come into medical school than their non-disabled peers. And one of the things we'll be able to do is look at the GQ to see if there's empathy erosion that is similar across these two groups. But we also found that students with disabilities are more likely to be burnt out. And so if you look at the two measures of burnout, one of the things that happened, which was really interesting, is they get tired, they're exhausted, but they're not disengaging from the environment. So when we talk about burnout, a lot of the concern is that obviously both sections, but one of the big concerns is just disengaging from the patient and disengaging from the environment. And what we found was that students with disabilities didn't disengage. So even though there are higher levels of burnout overall, there's some protective mechanism, we believe, in having had that lived experience of disability. So we're going to go to questions now. And just really quickly, if you are a Twitter follower, we do have a lab Twitter. It is @docswith, and that's all of our work. And if you go to docswithdisabilities.org, that covers the entire initiative, which is multiple programs, like I said, some of which Christine's involved in, and all of our research groups work. So you can find it there.
Lisa,
Right.
I just want to jump in and answer one of the questions because it's going to be super quick.
Sure.
One of the questions in the chat is, does